Why do we like swords? Not many people have ever held a sword, but we all know what one is. It's a long piece of metal with a pointy end to thrust or cut with, and a hilt to hold onto. With the earliest arrival of the firearms in the 16th century, the sword as a weapon of war has been on the decline. But as guns advanced to shoot further, faster and more reliably, the sword stayed more or less the same. But by World War I, the sword was thoroughly outgunned. Even though the sword ceased to be relevant as a tool in the modern world, it has continued to be a mainstay culturally. Why is that? The sword today is present in sports, like fencing and sparring. The sword is used for ceremonial reasons, like for the UK's own knighting ceremony, where individuals who have been thought to have made an outstanding contribution in their field are awarded official honours, thereby becoming a dame or a sir. The ceremony is itself a continuation of the older tradition involving squires, typically young men, becoming the iconic armoured knights who are sworn to chivalry. Countries across the world incorporate the sword into their militaries for ceremonial purposes, for graduations, parades, displays, and even military funerals. But most influentially, the sword is all over our stories, new and old, whether that's in our books, on our screens, or in our traditions and legends. So just why is the sword everywhere? It's because the sword has captured our imagination, not because of what it is, but because of how we see them. There's a case to be made that swords as we imagine them in the modern world were created by storytellers as much as any blacksmith. Our collective culture is filled with stories about famous swords wielded by fantastical figures. One of the most recurring concepts in all of fiction, myth and legend is the idea of the magic sword, a sword that is special because of its power and because of what it represents. Some are fictional, like the sword that was broken from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Narsil was a long sword used by the Prince of Isildur to cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand during the final battle of the War of the Last Alliance, later to be reforged into Anduril, the sword of Aragorn, heir to the throne of Gondor. While other swords are legends, such as the most famous sword of all, Excalibur, the sword of King Arthur. Depending on the story, it was pulled from a stone and anvil or bestowed by the Lady of the Lake. Details about Excalibur have changed over its long history, such as where it's from and what it could do, but it is understood that by wielding Excalibur, Arthur proves he is a worthy king. Even Luke Skywalker is just a peasant farmer, so he takes up his father's sword to fight the evil empire. A cool sword is a cool sword, but it is the actions of the wielder that make a sword special, one that we want to tell stories about. So what kind of stories do we hear? We've all heard of the knight in shining armour, the archetype of a perfect knight, arriving to save the day. The knight is not ideal because they are the strongest fighter, they are ideal because they are chivalrous. Chivalry is the code of conduct that the medieval Christian knights of Europe were supposed to follow. They should defend the church and the weak, be generous and brave, be loyal to your nation and to your pledged lord, and they must fight injustice. Other cultures have their own versions of this, like Japan's Bushido Code, followed by their own iconic warrior class, the samurai, wielders of the world-famous katana. The chivalrous knight is so good that we want to believe it, but in reality chivalry belongs to an ideal world that never really existed, beyond the imagination of writers old and new, who were themselves influenced by such famous stories like King Arthur and his court. It is the poetry of chivalric ideals that colours our view of the sword, and now they are linked to the heroic and honourable figures of our romanticised past, and the literary figures inspired by them, whose stories we are exposed to over and over again. This is what distinguishes the gun from the sword. We live in the time of gun violence, but the time of the sword has long since passed, and now it belongs to the world of fantasy and imagination, places we can only visit through the stories we consume, and these are worlds where the good guys beat the odds with their trusty sword. Sword empowers an individual to right wrongs, retake control and claim their destiny. That is a fantasy that appeals to everyone. You don't have to be a knight. That's why we cling to the sword in the modern day. It is a reminder of supposedly old ideals like honour and bravery. But as old Obi-Wan Kenobi said, the weapon of a Jedi Knight is not as clumsy or random as a blaster. It's an elegant weapon for a more civilized age, even if that more civilized age never existed. The sword reminds us of the best aspects of it. Yes, a sword is just a weapon, but it can symbolise a whole lot more, and I think that's why we like swords. Thanks for watching.